Hi, welcome. This is the screencast on the respiratory system. I am doing things a little bit differently and using presenter mode so I get this red cursor. We'll see how that works. It makes it a little bit harder for me to annotate the slides and draw, but I like having the red cursor. So respiratory system, first thing we want to do is revisit this equation on cellular respiration. You may recall from Anatomy and Physiology 1 that your body burns glucose and uses the energy from glucose to make ATP. Now, if you are going to burn something, what gas is it that you need to burn? Right, this blank, oh, see there, look, I did it. This blank here then should be O2. And then your byproducts are water and CO2. Right, so because of your cellular respiration, this is exactly why you have external respiration. So this O2 here in the equation is the same O2 that you suck into your mouth when you breathe. And this CO2 is the same CO2 that you exhale. There is some chemistry that happens to this CO2 as it's floating through your bloodstream, but the CO2 that you exhale does come from this equation right here. So this is why your lungs exchange gas, because you need to supply your body with oxygen and get rid of CO2. So we start with just some sort of anatomical review. I'm not going to ask you to identify the nose, so you should just know what it does here. I won't belabor that point, just read this slide and know the functions of the nose. For the pharynx, really what you want to know is this bullet point or whatever up here, that it is a common pathway for food and water, and know basically where it extends from and to, but we're not going to worry about the different regions of the pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, or laryngopharynx, just pharynx. Larynx, we will learn to identify in lab. Actually, let me just skip to the next slide. I should have deleted that first one. This is what the larynx looks like. You'll learn to identify the parts of it, like the different cartilages, in lab. For a lecture, just know what its functions are, and those are here. Patent airway just means it always stays open, so all of this blue stuff is cartilage, and that is stiff, and it's there so that your windpipe doesn't collapse. So just know the larynx. For trachea, again, we're going to learn a little bit about trachea in lab, but for a lecture, we want to know what the 3 layers of the trachea are, from inside to out, the mucosa, right? So you will recall from Anatomy and Physiology 1, any bodily cavity that opens up onto the outside world is lined by a mucous membrane. So your respiratory tract, your GI tract, and your urogenital tract, all lined by mucous membranes. So it's mucosa, and in lab we're going to learn that the epithelium associated with your respiratory mucosa is a pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So this you'll want to know. You have submucosa and then adventitia, which is connective tissue. The most important thing to know is underlined here, is that the adventitia, or the outer layer of your trachea, contains hyaline cartilage, which again is for structural support. Moving right along, now we have the conductive zone and the respiratory zone. I have added this on Canvas, and is not in the original objectives that I posted, but I want you to know it. And basically what you want to do is just know which items of anatomy are in the conductive zone and which items of anatomy are in the respiratory zone. So conductive just means it's responsible for getting air from one part of your respiratory tract to another. No gas exchange is going to take place there. So trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles are all conductive zone. And then your respiratory zone is basically anywhere that you find alveoli. So a respiratory bronchiole is a bronchiole that has a few alveoli coming off of it, like here. And then deep to all of these alveoli there that you can see, there's a passageway that runs, I'm not going to draw it, but that runs through all of them, and that is your alveolar duct. And then you have your alveoli. So it's the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar duct, and then the alveoli themselves are all your respiratory zone. Okay, next is the respiratory membrane. This is your first open-ended essay type question, but it's just a list for the exam. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at one time. So it is there are 3 layers that gases have to cross to get from the blood vessels into the air of the alveolus, or vice versa. So here you have whoops, I can't draw very well, right? There's an epithelial cell there that makes up the wall of the alveolus, and then the blood vessel itself also has an epithelium, which would be right there, and then in between the two of them is a shared basement membrane, which would be right here. What an awful drawing. But you get the idea. You've got an epithelium that lines the inside of the blood vessel, surrounded by a basement membrane, and then on top of that, the epithelial cells that make up the wall of your alveoli. So all like here's an epithelial cell, and there, all around it. So you just need to list those layers. It's not too hard. So next up is just learning the parts of the alveoli. So in this image you can't really see it, but there are elastic fibers around the alveolus. So they're sort of built into the wall of each alveolus are elastic fibers. In addition to the type 1 epithelial cells, you have type 2 cells. They secrete surfactant. We will go over later in this lecture the role of surfactant. I don't know if it's in the objectives, but it is something that you do want to know. And then you have alveolar macrophages. So, right, these are monocytes that have crawled out of the bloodstream, diapedesis, into the alveoli, and they just crawl around and eat whatever's not supposed to be there. Then we have another possible open-ended question, which is just describing the blood supply. So this is sort of similar to the heart, where the heart pumps blood. So there's blood that moves through the heart so that the heart can serve the blood. And then there's your coronary circulation, blood that moves through the heart so that the blood can serve the heart. So you have the same thing with your lungs. Your pulmonary circulation is the blood that flows through the lungs so that the lungs can provide oxygen to the blood. And these blood vessels we're already familiar with, right? Your pulmonary arteries carry blood away from the heart to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, and then the pulmonary veins carry the blood back to the heart. So you want to be able to, for this question, just list what is the purpose of the pulmonary circulation to get oxygen in the blood, and then what are the blood vessels involved. And then for the systemic circulation, right, this is arterial blood, oxygenated arterial blood coming off of the aorta somewhere, and it is to deliver oxygen to the lungs, so that it's the opposite, right? Pulmonary circulation is so that the lungs can get oxygen into the blood. Systemic circulation is so that the blood can bring oxygen to the tissues in the lungs that aren't right part of an alveolar wall. And it's the bronchial arteries that bring the oxygenated blood to the lung tissues from the outside in. There's some complicated plumbing that we're not going to go over But ultimately, this bronchial arterial blood ends up being carried back to the heart through the same pulmonary veins that are part of the pulmonary circulation. All right, then we get into the pleura. This is relatively straightforward. Right, this is the serous membrane that covers your lungs. So the outside of the serous membrane is the parietal pleura. Then the inside of the serous membrane is the visceral pleura. And if you look here, there is just a very small space in between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. That's your pleural cavity, and is always filled with a little bit of serous fluid for lubrication. So when your lungs move, your chest cavity goes up and down. I shouldn't say your lungs don't really move, but your chest wall is going to rise and fall when you inhale and exhale. So your ribs are moving up and down relative to your lungs. Now, your lungs are somewhat delicate tissue. So if you had something bony or even just a membrane of the bone rubbing up against the lungs, you would rub a hole in your lungs. So instead of your lungs rubbing up against your thoracic wall, you have a smooth serous membrane rubbing up against a smooth serous membrane with some lubricating serous fluid in between so that none of the tissues get damaged. This picture here just shows, right, this would be this outer layer here would be parietal pleura, and then the visceral pleura is glued to the surface of the lungs, and you just have the pleural cavity. So now we get into some pressures. These we do want to understand. It's not super complicated, but I think a little complicated. First, you want to understand atmospheric pressure, which you're probably familiar with. There is air all around you. More importantly, there is air above you, and gravity acts on that air. So it is pushing down on you and in on you from all sides. Right? So that's atmospheric pressure. I am not going to ask you what atmospheric pressure normally is, but you do want to pay attention to which pressures are higher and which pressures are lower. Then you have intrapulmonary pressure. This is the pressure in your alveoli, and this is going to go up and down as you breathe. Right? So you expand your lungs, intrapulmonary pressure is going to go down. Because your lungs are connected to the atmosphere, atmospheric pressure pushes air into your lungs until your lungs are full, right? Then intrapulmonary pressure is going to equal atmospheric pressure until your lungs start to recoil, and then you'll push the air out. So that's intrapulmonary pressure. Then you have intrapleural pressure. This one I think is a little bit harder to understand, but it's just the pressure in your pleural cavity. So the pressure in that very small space right here, let me move that over the way, right? That little black arrow, that's your pleural cavity, and the intrapleural pressure is the pressure in there. Books sometimes refer to it as a negative pressure. The number, if you were to measure it, is not negative, but it is always less than your atmospheric and your intrapulmonary pressure. Most importantly, it's lower than your intrapulmonary pressure. This is because your lungs want to recoil. They want to get smaller. So they're always pulling away from the inside of your rib cage so that they would collapse, but they don't collapse because atmospheric pressure is the outward force that's holding them open. The inward forces that encourage your lungs to collapse are the elastic recoil of the lungs, so that elastic tissue around all of your alveoli. And the way you want to think of it, if I go back here, right, is that you are born, your lungs are a certain size, and basically your thoracic cavity grows a little bit faster than your lungs do. And as your thoracic cavity grows, that intrapleural pressure there gets lower, right? As the space in between your lungs and your thorax gets bigger, the pressure drops. Atmospheric pressure comes in and pushes your lungs open. So even when your chest is relaxed and your thoracic volume is as small as it's going to be, your lungs still want to go smaller because of that elastic tissue, and it's atmospheric pressure that's holding them open. Then you also have surface tension, which is pulling in on the walls of your alveoli. And here's where I'm going to try and draw. I apologize, it's probably not going to be pretty, but we want to understand surface tension. So imagine that this is an alveolus. Lining your alveolus is mucus. And I'm just going to draw a bunch of little blobs here. These are supposed to be water molecules in the mucus, right? Water, you may have learned in Anatomy and Physiology 1, but probably not, has surface tension. This is because water molecules are always attracted to each other, right? That is a result of the fact that they are very good at hydrogen bonding. And water molecules want a hydrogen bond with each other. Air, oxygen, nitrogen, CO2, and other gases are nonpolar, so water molecules can't hydrogen bond with the air. That means this water molecule is always being attracted to that water molecule, and that water molecule, and this water molecule is attracted to that water molecule. So all of the water in your mucus wants to be next to other water molecules in your mucus, which means what your mucus really wants to do is, whoops, where did my pen go? Oh, I see. I don't know what I did there. Oh, there we go. Your mucus just wants to form a ball in the middle of your alveoli. But this is where things get complicated, right? The surface of your cells, that phospholipid bilayer, you will recall the polar head group on the phospholipid bilayer is able to hydrogen bond with the water. So the water molecules want to be next to each other in a ball in the middle, but they also want to stay next to your alveolar wall because the water can hydrogen bond with the cells that line your alveolus. So as the water molecules are all being pulled towards the middle because they all want to be next to each other, they're also pulling in on your alveolar wall because they also want to be next to it. So your mucus is basically pulling in on the walls of all of your alveoli, trying to get them to form a ball of mucus in the middle because of this surface tension. What the surfactant does, it's kind of like soap. It forms a layer in between the polar water and the nonpolar gases. And like surfactant, if I were to draw a surfactant molecule, bear with me, this is awful, I know, but it would have one surface of the surfactant molecule would have charges on it and would be polar, and the other surface of the surfactant molecule would be nonpolar. So this surface would align itself with the water molecules and hydrogen bond with the water molecules, and then this surface would be exposed to the air. So it forms a bridge or a barrier in between the air and the water molecules, and gives something for the water molecules to hydrogen bond with that aren't other water molecules. So again, it's sort of a buffer in between the polar water and the nonpolar air. This is, I think, what is referred to as an amphoteric molecule. It has both polar and nonpolar regions, so it can bridge the gap. This, by the way, used to be the limiting factor on whether or not a premature baby would be able to survive outside the womb. If they had stayed in the womb and developed long enough such that they could produce their own surfactant, they would survive. If they weren't to the point where they were producing their own surfactant, they wouldn't survive outside the womb. We now have the ability to manufacture and then mist. I don't know if they just mist directly in their face or if they have to intubate them, but we can get artificial surfactant into the lungs of premature babies, and they're able to survive being born at an earlier age than they previously would. All right, moving right along. Atelectasis means your lungs collapse. This usually happens when you have pneumothorax. So if we go back, let's just say here, right? Your lungs want to collapse, but they don't collapse because air can't get in there. Oh, I didn't know that was going to happen. So when your lungs try and pull away, atmospheric pressure keeps them from shrinking. And because the atmosphere can't get in here, that's what keeps them open. But if you punch a hole in somebody's thoracic wall, now that elastic recoil and surface tension can pull in on your lungs, and your lungs can shrink, and the atmosphere can get on the outside of the lungs and on the inside of the lungs, so it's no longer pushing just on the inside, and then your lungs can collapse. And the plugged bronchioles, I'm assuming they can cause your alveoli to collapse, because when you relax your chest cavity, that is greater force than when you expand your chest cavity. So when you push the air out, when you relax, that creates more force than the atmospheric pressure does pushing the air in. So if your bronchioles are plugged, you can get air out, but then when you go to breathe in, atmospheric pressure isn't heavy enough, or it isn't enough pressure to push through the plugged bronchioles, so you can't inhale. Then we have breathing. This used to be an essay question. It is not anymore. You want to know sort of two things about each process, inhaling and exhaling. The first thing is you want to know whether or not it's an active or a passive process. So inspiration is always an active process. Your diaphragm descends. That increases the space in your thoracic cavity. That is a muscular contraction, so it is an active process. So as your diaphragm descends, this increases the volume in your thoracic cavity. That in turn stretches out your lungs, and as your lungs get bigger, your intrapulmonary volume increases. Your intrapulmonary pressure is going to drop. It is going to go lower than atmospheric pressure, and air will flow in until your intrapulmonary pressure meets atmospheric pressure. Then when you exhale, as long as it is quiet expiration, it is a passive process. So if you simply let out your breath, that is your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm relaxing, and your thoracic wall just elastically recoiling. If you're trying to blow out candles, then that's an active process that requires contraction of your abdominal muscles and your internal intercostals to compress your thoracic cavity and push air out. But inspiratory muscles relax, thoracic volume decreases, so lung volume, intrapulmonary volume decreases. That increases the pressure, and air flows out until intrapulmonary pressure equals atmospheric pressure. So mostly you want to keep active and passive straight for inspiration and expiration respectively, and just sort of have the order of operations down too. But this would be true, false, multiple choice type questions, not essays. And that is going to do it for this screencast. Part 2 we'll pick up with Dalton's Law.